I always thought my parents would love my children the way they claimed to love me. I never imagined the day would come when they'd sit across from me, stone-faced, and say, "Lauren, we'd still like you to come for Thanksgiving, but not the kids." At first I laughed. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. And what followed was the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and blood. It started with an email. Yes, an actual email, not a call, not even a message. Just a cold, two-paragraph email from my mother with the subject line, "Thanksgiving plans." I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, still in my robe. My kids were in the other room, Eli playing with Legos, Grace brushing her doll's hair. The email read, "Lauren, we're looking forward to hosting Thanksgiving again this year. Please know that we'd still love for you to come. However, given everything that's happened with the divorce and how tense things have become, we feel it's best if Eli and Grace sit this one out." I blinked, reread it, blinked again. My first instinct? Surely this is some kind of mistake. So I called my mom, straight to voicemail. I texted, nothing. 5 hours later, I got a reply from my dad. "This isn't meant to hurt, it's just for the peace of the family, you understand?" Understand? That they invited me but not the two humans I birthed? Let me back up a little. My parents always had a soft spot for my brother Eric. He was the golden boy, smooth-talking, successful, and, honestly, kind of a jerk. But he made them proud in the way they cared about. Big house, big car, fancy job. Me? I chose the slower life. I left corporate after burnout, started consulting from home, and spent most of my energy raising two decent, kind, funny kids. After my divorce, I thought I'd finally earned some space to breathe. But I guess in their eyes, my newly single mom label was a stain on the family image. And I realized, sitting at that table, rereading their words, that this wasn't about one holiday. This was about how they saw me, and my kids. They were okay with me, as long as I didn't bring the parts of my life they disapproved of. I called Eric out of sheer desperation, hoping he might tell me this was all a misunderstanding. "Look," he said, not even pretending to be surprised. "Mom and Dad just want things to be normal. You showing up with two kids and all that tension, it's a lot for them." All that tension? You mean my divorce from a man who lied, drained my bank account, and ran off with his Pilates instructor? Sorry for being inconvenient. That was the moment something inside me shifted. The version of me who begged for crumbs of kindness from people who couldn't see my worth. She stood up and walked out of the room. I put down the phone, looked at my kids through the doorway. Eli, still in his PJs, humming quietly, and Grace, with that little furrow in her brow she gets when she's concentrating. And I knew right then, if they weren't welcome, I wasn't going. But I also knew this: I was done pretending any of this was okay. And what came next surprised even me. The next morning, I sat down and drafted a reply. I didn't rage. I didn't plead. I just wrote, "Thanks for the invitation, but if Eli and Grace aren't welcome, I won't be attending either. Family isn't family if it's conditional." I hit send. No emojis, no signature. You'd think that would have ended it, that they'd get the message. But no. Within an hour, my dad called. "Lauren," he sighed like he'd just finished chopping wood. "You're taking this too personally. We just thought that I'd be okay leaving my children home alone on Thanksgiving?" He paused. No one said alone. "You could leave them with a sitter, or even Matt." Matt, my ex-husband. The man who moved 3 states away, sends child support late, and only remembers birthdays when Facebook reminds him. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked. And for the first time in years, I didn't care how cold my voice sounded. Here's the thing. My parents had this curated image of our family. They loved smiling Christmas cards and Sunday brunches where everyone laughed on cue. But what they loved even more was control. And when I left my husband, I took away their narrative. To them, I went from our Lauren, who married the VP of a firm, to our Lauren, the divorcee with 2 kids and no steady paycheck. I ruined their aesthetic. And now they wanted to Photoshop my kids out of the picture entirely. Later that day, I got a message from my brother's wife, Kara. "Hey, just so you know, we'll be bringing the twins. I hope that's okay?" I stared at her text for a full minute. It wasn't a question. It was a flaunt. See, Kara's kids could set the kitchen on fire and still get dessert. Mine get left off the guest list for existing. So I replied, "Of course, I won't be there, but I'm sure they'll be thrilled." She didn't answer. The days passed and Thanksgiving got closer. I started getting messages from my aunt, my cousin, even my high school English teacher, who apparently was still friends with my mother. They all had the same tone. "It's such a shame this drama is ruining the holiday." Drama? I wasn't the one who weaponized hospitality. I was just refusing to play along. But here's what really hit me. One night, Grace crawled into my bed and whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" That shattered me. I wrapped her in my arms and told her no, over and over again, until she finally fell asleep. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a dinner. This was about protecting my kids from growing up thinking love should ever be earned by silence. So I made a decision. I booked a cabin 2 hours away, packed board games, marshmallows, and every comfort food we could carry, and we left. While the rest of my family gathered around a perfect table pretending nothing was broken, we were laughing around a fire, making burnt s'mores, and memory keeping our own tradition. And for the first time in years, I felt full, not with food, but with peace. What I didn't know then was that their rejection was only the beginning. The next surprise would come from an entirely different direction, one with a credit card bill and a name I hadn't heard in a long time. After Thanksgiving, I expected more noise. Angry calls, passive-aggressive texts, maybe a handwritten letter from my mother. She always liked the drama of cursive disappointment. But there was nothing. Radio silence. At first I thought it was just a cooling-off period, that maybe deep down they'd realized how wrong it was to try and separate a mother from her children. But no apology came, no olive branch, just space. And I'll admit, the silence was disorienting. I'd spent most of my life wrapped in the static of family opinion, their expectations, their criticism, their approval, all of it like background noise I'd learned to live with. But now? Quiet. It was a strange kind of freedom, the kind you don't trust at first. I kept checking my phone, rereading old texts, wondering if I was missing something. But there was nothing new. The group chat they used to include me in? Still active. I could see the photos. Christmas tree lighting, brunch with Eric's family, new ornaments on the family tree. No sign of Eli or Grace. No mention of me. Just perfectly filtered snapshots of a family I apparently no longer belonged to. And yet, my home had never felt calmer. Eli started drawing more, full, colorful comic strips he taped to the fridge. Grace spent hours building cozy forts under the dining room table. There was laughter, music, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. We were healing, not in big dramatic moments, but in everyday peace. Still, part of me was bracing, waiting for the next blow. And when it came, it didn't come in the form of words. It came as numbers. On a credit card bill I hadn't touched in nearly 8 months. It was a joint account, one I'd opened during my marriage with Matt. We'd stopped using it when we separated, or so I thought. I hadn't checked it in months. But there it was, sitting in my inbox. "Your statement is ready." I clicked, and my jaw dropped. $3,200 at a furniture store in Bend, Oregon. $1,100 for event catering. $560 at a spa I'd never heard of. All of it dated the week after Thanksgiving. At first I thought it was fraud, but then I saw the billing address, my parents' house. I froze. Why was a dormant credit card that hadn't been touched in almost a year suddenly being used and linked to my parents? I called the bank. The agent confirmed it. The card had been reactivated and used with online verification. Somehow, someone had managed to reset the access using my maiden name and old recovery email, the one my mother still had access to. I was livid. But more than that, I was hurt. This wasn't about the money. I could dispute the charges. It was the violation. It was confirmation of what I'd already started to suspect. They didn't see boundaries. Not emotional ones, not financial ones. To them, I was still a daughter they could manage, manipulate, and when necessary, mine for resources. And suddenly, the silence wasn't confusing anymore. It was strategic. They'd gone quiet because they didn't want me to see what they were doing in the background. I closed the laptop, sat on the floor, and for the first time in weeks I cried. Not because I missed them, but because I finally believed they weren't coming back. not as the people I needed them to be. But what I didn't realize yet was that this credit card mess was just the tip of the iceberg, because beneath the charges was a plan, and I wasn't the only one they'd tried to play. I didn't wait. First thing Monday morning, I filed a fraud dispute. I wasn't going to argue with my parents directly. Not this time. I'd spent too many years being talked in circles, gaslighted until I questioned my own instincts. Let the bank sort it out. But while I was on the phone with the fraud department, something odd came up. "Ma'am," the agent said, "we're seeing that these transactions were authorized through a family share account. Do you have anyone listed as a secondary user?" I frowned. "Not since last year. That should have been removed when the account was frozen." He paused. "It appears your mother re-added herself last month using the original security questions." My stomach dropped. I remembered the questions. "What's your favorite color?" "Blue." "What's your childhood pet's name?" "Muffin." Answers she helped me choose back when I was 19 and didn't think twice about who might use them later. She hadn't just stolen access, she walked right through the front door I forgot to lock. I hung up, my hands shaking. I wasn't naive. I knew they looked down on my choices. But this? This was premeditated, calculated. They hadn't even asked. They just took. I pulled up the charges again, scanned through them with new eyes. That catering bill? It was for Eric and Kara's holiday party. The furniture? A new dining set? Likely purchased to host the perfect family Christmas. Without me. It all made sense. They weren't just replacing me at the table, they were using my name to fund it. I laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. The kind of bitter laugh that rises up when you're so far past shocked. There's nothing else left. They had cut me off emotionally, then quietly used me financially. And yet somehow, if I confronted them, I would be the dramatic one. I could hear it already. "Oh, come on, Lauren, it's just a mistake. We thought the card was still a family backup." Or worse. "If you're going to isolate yourself from the family, maybe don't get so precious about shared resources." That was always the angle. Twist the story just enough to make my reaction the problem. But I'd changed. This time I didn't reply. Didn't call. I collected the evidence, wrote a formal letter to the bank, and shut down the account completely. No warning, no heads up, just silence. The kind I'd finally learned to value. But it didn't stop there. A week later, a letter showed up at my door. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written in my mother's perfect handwriting. Inside, a note that read, "Lauren, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. You made it impossible to help you. We did what we had to do. Please think of the family before you burn every bridge." I sat with that for a long time. The handwriting was familiar, the guilt was weaponized. They'd done something wrong. But I was being told I was the one burning bridges. Classic. I didn't respond. I tucked the letter into a drawer I now call the archive. It sits alongside old birthday cards signed with love I no longer believe in, and photos from a childhood that looks warm but felt cold. I wasn't playing their game anymore, and I had no idea, not yet, that the next card they'd play would be the dirtiest one yet, because when they realized they couldn't manipulate me with love or guilt, they turned to something else. My kids. 2 weeks later, I got the email. It was from a law office, one I didn't recognize, with the subject line, "Preliminary Notice of Intent Regarding Guardianship and Grandparent Rights." I read it 3 times before it registered. They weren't just upset, they were making a move. According to the email, my parents had begun consultations regarding potential legal avenues for securing structured visitation with Eli and Grace. The phrase used was, "to protect the continuity of extended familial relationships in the best interest of the minors." I almost choked on my coffee. Continuity? These were the same people who didn't want my kids at Thanksgiving, who used my credit card without permission, who hadn't seen either child in weeks, by their own choosing. Now they wanted the law to force a connection. I felt my blood boil. But under the heat, there was something else. Sadness. I'd always hoped, somewhere in the back of my heart, that this was temporary, that one day they'd wake up and realize what they were doing. But this was war. I immediately called a family lawyer, not to panic, but to prepare. and what she told me chilled me to my core. In Oregon, they'd have to prove that the lack of contact is causing actual harm to the children. It's a high bar, but not impossible if they fabricate enough concern. Fabricate. That word sat like a stone in my chest. Would they go that far? Then I remembered. These are the people who rewrote the family history every time something uncomfortable happened. The people who convinced me for years that I was too sensitive when they crossed lines. They wouldn't lie outright, but they'd bend reality just enough to make me look like the unstable one. It was a playbook I knew too well. And the scariest part? They had money, time, and no shame. So I documented everything. Screenshots of texts, bank statements, voicemails where they slipped up and said too much. I even asked Grace's therapist to write a letter confirming the stress my daughter had shown after certain family interactions. I built a file, not because I wanted a fight, but because I needed armor. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Eli, my quiet, observant son, handed me a drawing he'd made. It was our house, me in the kitchen, Grace playing on the floor, and two stick figures outside the window with big frowns and red X's over them. "Who's this?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "That's Grandma and Grandpa. They're mad, but we're okay in here." I stared at the picture, blinking hard. In his own way, Eli had captured everything. They were still watching, still angry, still outside. But inside our home, we were safe. That night, I framed the drawing and put it on my nightstand, not out of spite, but as a reminder that protecting my kids wasn't selfish, it was sacred. And if they wanted to escalate, so would I. Because I was done being the quiet daughter, the agreeable daughter, the one who always smoothed things over. They had turned my childhood into a debt they expected me to keep paying. But I had a new account now, and it only had space for peace, honesty, and boundaries. The next thing I'd discover, they weren't finished, not by a long shot. And the next letter I got, the one tied with a ribbon, would prove just how far they were willing to go. It arrived in a gold box, not an envelope, not a plain package. A box, hand-delivered, no postage, no card, just a gold ribbon tied too tightly, like someone had tried too hard to make it look effortless. At first, I thought it was from a client. I'd been consulting again, small business turnarounds, branding refreshes. A few referrals had turned into steady work, but the box felt personal. I opened it cautiously. Inside, a framed photograph of me, my parents, and my children, taken 3 years ago at Cannon Beach. Grace was still in pull-ups. Eli had a crooked, toothy grin. I was laughing. Genuinely. My mother's arm was looped through mine. Taped to the back of the frame was a folded letter. Not printed, handwritten. Again. It started like a poem. "Before you forget, remember what we looked like when we were still whole." It went on to describe birthdays and beach trips, how I used to fall asleep on my dad's shoulder during road trips, how my mom sacrificed everything so I could go to college. Then came the dagger. "You were always ungrateful, Lauren. You took and then turned your back. What did we do to deserve this? Why do you want to raise your children without the only family who truly knows them?" There it was. Not an apology, not an olive branch. A guilt trip disguised as nostalgia. And the worst part? It almost worked. I felt it, deep in my chest. That tug of war between memory and reality, between what I wanted them to be and what they were. But then I flipped the letter over. In smaller handwriting, clearly added after the fact, were the words, "We're still open to visitation if you come to your senses." My mouth went dry. Not only had they sent a framed photo of a happier time, they'd weaponized it. It wasn't a gift, it was bait. A picture-perfect trap, designed to make me second-guess the very boundaries that were keeping us safe. I sat on the couch, the photo in my lap, and stared at younger me. She looked so free. But I remembered exactly how that day ended. My mom criticized the way I parented. My dad made a joke about my career that stung for weeks. I'd cried in the car ride home while the kids napped in the back. The smile in that photo? It was real, but incomplete. Because it came before I realized how conditional their love had become. I wrapped the letter back up, returned it to the box, and placed both high on a shelf in my closet. Not to honor it, but to remind myself of what I'm not returning to. That night, I wrote my own letter. Not to send, just to say the things out loud. Dear Mom and Dad, I am not your mirror. I am not your investment. I am not your redemption. I am a mother now. And my job is to make sure my children never confuse control with love. I folded it and tucked it next to Eli's drawing. My archive was growing. And though it hurt, it was also healing. Because clarity isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's cruel. But it gives you back your power. And I was just getting started. The very next morning, I took the final step, and it would make headlines at our local school. Because while they tried to get in through the court system, I got ahead of them at the front office, and I left no doors open. At 8:15 a.m., I walked into the main office at my children's elementary school. The receptionist, Cheryl, looked up and smiled. Morning, Ms. Blake. Everything okay? I smiled back, calm but firm. I need to update the emergency contact list and pick up authorizations immediately. She blinked, then nodded. Sure, of course. I filled out the form slowly and deliberately. I removed 2 names, Richard Blake and Elaine Blake. In the box marked reason for removal, I wrote, no longer trusted, legal consultations pending. Cheryl didn't ask questions, but her eyes widened just a little. She knew who my parents were. Everyone in Eastwood did. They donated to the PTA, hosted charity auctions, and wore the kind of polite smiles that made people say, what a nice family. I'd worn that illusion like a uniform for most of my life, but not anymore. I submitted the form, signed at the bottom, and asked Cheryl to place a red highlight on their file in the system. If they show up, I said clearly, call me, not them, and under no circumstances should the kids be released to them. She hesitated. You're sure? I'm sure. Because I wasn't just guarding my peace now, I was guarding 2 lives that depended on me to be clear, consistent, and brave. It didn't take long for word to get back to my parents. 3 days later, I got a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was thin, trembling, but rehearsed. I can't believe you'd involve the school. That's public embarrassment, Lauren. Do you understand what that looks like? Yes, I did. It looked like truth finally casting a shadow on their image. I didn't respond. The next call came from my dad, angrier. You're making a mistake. You're poisoning your kids against their own blood. That's abuse, Lauren. That's what this is now. That word, abuse, hit like a slap. Coming from the man who once told me, you cry too easily to ever be a real leader. The man who taught me that silence was the only way to be accepted. I didn't cry this time. I forwarded the message to my lawyer, because I'd learned something important. When manipulative people lose access to you, they often escalate. They twist love into obligation. They twist protection into punishment. They will say you're the one hurting everyone, just because you finally said no. And yet, it was peaceful. I was sleeping again. My kids were more relaxed. Even Grace had stopped asking if we were in trouble with Grandma. One evening, Eli looked up from his cereal and said, Mom, we haven't seen them in a while. Are they mad at us? I bent down, looked him straight in the eye, and said, No, sweetheart, they're mad at me. And that's okay, because my job isn't to make them happy. My job is to keep us safe. He nodded once, then went back to his cereal. That moment stayed with me, because it was the first time I said it out loud, not just to a friend or a lawyer or in my journal, but to my son. I was done sugarcoating, and I was done fearing backlash for doing the right thing. The line was drawn. No more gray areas, no more loopholes. If they wanted to rewrite history, they could do it without access to my children. Because I had finally figured out that being a good daughter didn't mean being a quiet one. And being a good mom, it meant saying, this far, no further. I used to think rebuilding your life meant starting over. New house, new friends, new job, a total transformation. The kind that makes people gasp and say, wow, you've changed. But that's not what happened. What I built looked ordinary, soft, unremarkable from the outside. And that's exactly what made it extraordinary. It started with a kitchen drawer. I replaced the old one that always stuck, the one that had warped in the humidity and drove me crazy for years. No contractors, no fuss, just me, a screwdriver, and the determination to not live with small daily annoyances anymore. Next came the phone plan. I got a new number. The final goodbye to endless just checking in texts or passive aggressive group chats with distant cousins I hadn't seen since 2011. My contact list shrank. My peace grew. Then came the people. Real friends emerged, like shells in the tide once the sea of obligation pulled back. Casey, my neighbor across the street, started waving when I picked up the mail. One evening, she brought over banana bread, just because. We ended up on the porch until 1 a.m., talking about everything from parenting to wine preferences, to the exact moment we realized we were raising our kids differently than we were raised. We laughed a lot. We didn't apologize for it. Eli's teacher, Mr. Harmon, invited me to join the school's creative writing club as a volunteer. "We need someone who knows how to tell stories with bite," he said with a wink. I didn't tell him how much I needed that invitation. I just said yes. Even Grace changed. Her artwork became brighter. She stopped drawing little figures in the corners and started filling entire pages. One day, she drew a big purple tree and said, "This is where we live now, under this tree." I smiled. "Why a tree?" "Because it's strong," she said, "and it doesn't move when the wind screams." I nearly cried. We were healing, not because we had replaced what we lost, but because we stopped asking it to come back in a better form. I took up journaling again. Not the anxious scribbles I used to write at 1 a.m. out of desperation, but real reflections, gratitude lists, memories that made me smile instead of flinch. Sometimes I'd go days without thinking about them, my parents, the drama, the accusations, and when I did think of them, the feeling was muted, like watching a film I'd already seen. I knew how it ended. I didn't need to rewatch the pain. What surprised me most was the lack of regret. Not once did I think, maybe I was too harsh. Because every choice I made was with intention. Every boundary was a seed. And now, I was standing in the garden I'd planted with my own hands. Not perfect, not grand, but real, lush, alive. My kids laughed more. I smiled more. The house smelled like cinnamon sometimes, and nobody criticized the furniture. There was no script anymore, no performance. Just us, present, whole, unapologetic. And as the holidays approached, I didn't dread the mail. I didn't flinch at phone rings. I made new traditions. Cocoa with extra marshmallows, movies on Tuesdays, bedtime stories that ended with, "and they lived safely ever after." Because we were. We were safe. And that's better than happy. It's deeper. It's earned. They didn't break me. They revealed me. And once I stopped handing them the pen, I finally got to write my own story. Not a story of escape, but of emergence. It happened on a Saturday. I was folding laundry in the living room, a Disney soundtrack humming softly in the background, when there was a knock at the door. Not the doorbell. A knock. Firm. Familiar. I froze. The kids were upstairs. The dog didn't bark. The whole house suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. I peeked through the curtain, a black sedan. The one my parents used to drive before they upgraded. The one they kept for errands. For unannounced visits, apparently. I didn't open the door, not because I was scared, but because I was no longer available to be ambushed by nostalgia or guilt, wrapped in perfume and tailored coats. I stood there for a few seconds, unseen. The knock came again. Then silence. Eventually, the car drove away. No note, no call, just presence, and then absence. And I realized something. They were testing the lock. They wanted to see if I'd still open the door, if I'd melt, if I'd break, if the old version of me, the obedient, guilt-soaked daughter, would reach for the handle just out of habit. But that version of me was gone. She'd left quietly, without a scene. She was busy making pancakes upstairs, planning movie nights, and printing out science fair instructions. She was building trust with herself, and she didn't open doors that led back into fire. Because peace isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with confetti or closure speeches. Sometimes peace is a quiet refusal. Sometimes peace is a locked door and no explanation. Sometimes peace is the life you create on the other side of betrayal, not in spite of it, but because of it. That knock on the door was the last time they tried to reach me in person. They didn't try again. Maybe they realized the girl they once controlled had grown into a woman who no longer needed permission to live well. Maybe they finally saw that love without respect isn't love, it's leverage. Or maybe they just didn't like the view of their own reflection in the boundaries I set. Whatever the reason, they left. And I didn't chase after them. I sat back down, finished folding laundry, and hit play on the next song. Later, we made spaghetti and danced in the kitchen. Eli wore socks on the tile floor and wiped out in a dramatic spin. Grace laughed so hard she snorted. And I didn't check the driveway once. Because I wasn't waiting for anyone to come back. I was already home. Home in a space that didn't require performance. Home in a heart that didn't flinch at shadows anymore. Home in a life that was quieter, yes, but finally gloriously mine. And that door? It stays locked now, not out of fear, but out of wisdom, because not every knock deserves an answer, and not every visitor deserves a return.